Hi, I'm Amanda.
I'm Ellie.
And I'm Maya, and we will be talking today about the effects of redlining.
Ellie, what is the history of redlining?
The official practice of redlining began with Roosevelt's New Deal. In 1933, the New Deal was enacted to combat the Depression in America, but author Richard Rothstein notes the housing programs set up by the New Deal were basically a, quote, state-sponsored system of segregation, end quote, in an article by Terry Gross titled A Forgotten History of How the U.S. Government Segregated America, published May 2017 by NPR. The New Deal led to the building of public houses for all lower-class families, which sounds great, except the neighborhoods built for black citizens were in ghettos or undeveloped neighborhoods, whereas public housing for white families was in good, established neighborhoods. Then, in 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was established, perpetuating this segregation by refusing to insure mortgages in and near African-American neighborhoods.
How did refusing to finance these loans affect the families?
By refusing to finance these loans, the government was keeping these African-American families in the public housing, while the white people got to move out into nice homes with good mortgages, as noted in the article Public Housing, Government-Sponsored Segregation by Richard Rothstein, published October 2012 by American Prospect. Now jumping ahead to the start of World War II in 1939. During this time, the entire country's economy shifted to war productions. To accommodate the people that moved to work in factories, the government built homes. These homes were, of course, segregated. After the war concluded in 1945, with the GI Bill, the Federal Housing Association established neighborhoods for the white returning veterans with low mortgages, all before redlining and discrimination for homebuyers was banned in 1968 with the Fair Housing Act.
Did the African Americans try to move into these neighborhoods?
Yeah, so in 1948 in St. Louis, Missouri, the Shelleys, a black family, tried to move into a racially restricted neighborhood. The family was sued, saying they broke a covenant enacted in 1911 to keep African Americans out of this neighborhood. The Supreme Court unanimously sided with the prosecution simply because it was a private rather than state action. So basically, there was nothing wrong with telling people they couldn't live somewhere because of their race, but judicial enforcement could not be used to keep these people out, according to the webpage for the case published by Oyas. This is a step forward for integration, but there were still many obstacles that had to be overcome.
Ellie, you mentioned World War II era, and redlining extended way past that, and it still plays a big role in the poverty cycle today. The first challenge arises for the residents and homes of redline neighborhoods is the actual property value. Homes in neighborhoods that were originally deemed less desirable and more at risk have experienced a decline in the value of homes as well as a decline in the home ownership and rent, according to Daniel Aronson in an article published by the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago in February 2019. Studies show that people who live in these at-risk neighborhoods are also less likely to own their own homes at all. Therefore, they do not have access to savings and benefits that come along with the home ownership, as noted in an article titled Systematic Inequality by Angela Hanks, published February 2018 by American Progress. But for those African Americans that do own their homes, their houses account for the average 53% of their wealth profile, whereas home ownership only accounts for 39% of the average white family's wealth portfolio, according to an article by Peter Metz, published by Washington University of March 2016. So overall, for residents formerly redlined neighborhoods experience lower property value.
The decline or stagnant property values pose a challenge for the actual homeowners, but what about their children?
Studies show that these underprivileged neighborhoods have underprivileged schools as well. Studies show that students from low-income families are 5 times more likely to drop out of school than students from higher-income families, according to a webpage published on January 24, 2017. The lack of education leads to less opportunities as well as lower salaries in the long run. As corroborated in multiple sources, people without high school diplomas are more likely to turn to crime to support themselves, utilize public assistance programs, and become single parents. The average annual income of college degree holding 25 to 34-year-old adults, more than twice that of adults without a high school education. There are also much higher unemployment rate for those without a high school diploma. So these people that live in these underprivileged areas are less likely to stay in school and receive higher education, and if they do, they have more limited opportunities, perpetuating this cycle of poverty.
So Maya, how does redlining affect people's individual spendings on houses today?
So, according to the SIRS Knowledge Source article written by the New York Times called The Race-Based Mortgage Penalty on March 8, 2018, credit scores are a huge factor for when considering how redlining is present in today's society because banks are denying lending mortgages based on credit scores, even though credit scores are not publicly available.
How has redlining impacted financial trends for different races?
In an interview with Kai Risdall and Aaron Glantz from the marketplace called Barriers to Home Ownership Still Exist for People of Color on February 15, 2018. Glenn stated that, quote, the home ownership gap in America today is wider than it was when segregation was legal. Our investigation found that in 61 cities across America, that in all of these places, even when you control for income and the size of the loan and the neighborhood that somebody wants to buy in, that people of color are more likely to be turned away.
How have landmark events throughout history impacted redlining today?
According to the article written by Greta Cowell, with covenants, racism was written into Minneapolis housing. The scars are still visible. Published by MinnPost on February 22, 2019, the Supreme Court case in 1953, Shelley versus Kramer, showed how the government is not entirely banning these covenants from happening because the ruling didn't make it illegal to totally restrict covenants. The long-term effects of that have definitely shown in Minneapolis because Cowell stated that, quote, Minneapolis mapping prejudice has found nearly 20,000 deeds that contain racial or ethnic restrictions in Hennepin County and expects to find 10,000 to 15,000 more in the coming months as researchers and volunteers finish sifting through property records, end quote. According to an interview with Kai Risdall called Barriers for Home Ownership Still Exist for People of Color on February 15, 2018 by Marketplace, throughout many decades, presidents have made enforcement such as the Community Reinvestment Act in 1977. However, the CSRS knowledge source article Race-Based Mortgage Penalty written by the New York Times on March 8, 2018 stated that the Trump administration today has made it challenging for minorities like African Americans and Latinos who are in need of seeking loans to buy houses.
So even though redlining was outlawed years ago, its effects are still very present in our society today. Thank you for listening to our podcast.